If you've ever shopped for Fender Telecasters, then you've probably noticed there's an absolutely overwhelming amount of different models at different price points. So as this video asks, why are there so many Fender Telecasters? I think the answer is just that as the Telecaster has progressed over the years and different iterations have come out, different players have favored different specs. I think Fender's always trying to make multiple models in every price point to make everyone happy. So sometimes you'll see a reissue line that's trying to be cheaper than it should be and therefore has some shortcomings, or you'll see them put out a really great reissue line, but it's like so expensive that it's kind of unattainable. I feel like it's all just kind of trial and error, that is putting stuff out into the market and seeing what does well. There's been a bunch of hidden gems where maybe it didn't do well originally, but now they're well looked at. I think that's kind of the answer, is that they've always wanted to make a Telecaster for everyone. You just can't make one guitar for everyone. So there's just gonna have to be 3 or 4 different guitars at every price point. So if you're someone who's shopping for a Telecaster or just trying to learn more about the various versions that are out there, hopefully this video can help alleviate some of the confusion and maybe you'll learn about a line that you never knew existed. There's a bunch of videos that'll kind of go in depth on like whatever 5 models are available at that moment and give you a affiliate link in the description from Big Box Guitar Store. I wanted to do something a little different. There is literally 70 years of different Telecaster models and series, and I wanted to kind of do a quick dive into each series and each era of Telecaster, whether made in Mexico, Japan, US, or even plenty of other places actually. Between playing and collecting and then running the shop of Flashlight of Gear, I've been fortunate enough to own and sell over 500 Telecasters at this point, and I've played thousands. I've been able to play almost every guitar on this list, and I've even owned multiple examples of almost every guitar on this list, stretching all the way back from the 80s until now. We're not gonna go into vintage stuff as I wanted to, but that would just make this video excruciatingly long. So today we're gonna focus on the more modern Telecasters. I know for most of us, buying used is no problem, so I should note most of these you're only gonna be able to find used, but I am also going to be talking about the new stuff that you can buy wherever at any of the big box stores. And I'm gonna do a little bit of a comparison between those new ones and some of the older ones. At the end of this list, I'm going to do a really quick top 5 of the ones that are my favorites, where I think your money is best spent, the stuff that is the best kind of equilibrium of price and quality. I'm excited to dive in and take a look at over 40 different models and series of Telecasters today. We're gonna start with Fender Mexico. I know for a lot of us, our first Telecaster was a Fender made in Mexico Tele of some variety. I certainly know mine was. There's been a lot of different series made in Mexico since the 90s. Some really, really great ones, some not as great ones. Let's get right into it. The first one I wanna talk about is the Fender Standard Telecaster. I'll call these the silver label Teles. This was the original kind of Mexico run of standard Telecasters. These are made all the way from the early 90s up until right about at 2010. I think 2008 is the official cutoff for these, but I do remember seeing them available new a little later than that. These are just your straight up Mexican Telecaster. When somebody says Mexican Tele, this is probably the one they're referring to. They are reliable, they stay in tune, they sound good. They're certainly nothing fancy. They don't have like the best pickups in them or anything, but they do the job, and I think for the price point, they're really great. It's important to note that throughout this entire line, if it's one of the ones that uses rosewood, it will actually have real rosewood, but I will say most of the Mexico standard Teles are gonna be maple anyways. These are kind of a cool blend of vintage and modern specs. They have 21 frets, but a 9.5-inch radius, so a little bit flatter than a vintage style Tele. 6 saddle bridge rather than a 3 saddle on a vintage Tele. These are cool, right down the middle guitars. I back it. They are a great starting place for Teles. For a very brief period of time in the 90s, Fender actually stepped below their standard Telecaster in Mexico production. It made something called the Fender Squire series. No, this is not like your typical Squire Tele. This was a Mexico-made standard Tele with a little bit cheaper parts on it, and they called this the Squire series. These are okay. The necks and bodies are fine. I have no problem with them. The hardware and electronics are pretty cheap on these, so they don't stay in tune the best. They don't sound amazing right out of the box. A lot of people buy these guitars and mod them out and put whatever pickups and tuners and stuff they want on them, and that's definitely cool. I don't know if that's the best place to spend your money. Maybe just start on something a little bit better. If you find one of these for a good deal, they're not too bad, but they're certainly not as good as the regular standard Telecasters or pretty much anything else on this list. Unless it's a really great deal, I'd maybe pass on these. The winter 1996 Frontline catalog would be the last time that you would see the Fender Squire series be in production. But by the spring, just a few months later, they were advertising a Fender traditional Telecaster at a little bit lower price point than the standard Telecaster. I'm pretty sure these are just the exact same guitar. They both feature this all black label, and both have the same kind of specs. They have cheaper import parts, but decent necks and bodies. Basically refer to my Squire series review for this one as well. But I just wanted to point this one out because a lot of people call them standard Telecasters, but those black label ones from like 96 to 98 that don't say Squire series, they're traditional Telecasters. They are not standards and they do not have the same parts. Keep that in mind. They're not as good, but they're still fine. Around 2008, the Fender Standard Telecaster was given a refresh with a fresh logo and some other little tiny changes on it. It still retains a lot of the same specs, and I really like these. I would kind of give the same review as the older Standard Teles. I don't know why, but I kind of prefer the neck profile on these like 2008 to 2016 Standard Teles. They just feel really good, nice and snappy. Nothing to complain about. They're a great value for what they are. Over the years, Fender has done many FSR Telecasters from the Mexico factory, whether it is like something with an ash body or a special run for like a Guitar Center or Sam Ash or other like store specific run. Sometimes it'll just be a cool color, sometimes it will be different specs. This might be arbitrary, but I've always noticed the special run and FSR guitars being just a little bit better than the standards. If nothing else, the quality control always feels a little bit better. Sometimes I just prefer whatever special spec it is they bring into that model. But back at my time at UNF, when I started what became Flashfooted Gear and was selling a ton of Mexico-made Fender, I remember every time I ran into some sort of special run guitar made in Mexico, they would just tend to be a little bit better than the standards. Sometimes it might have just been because it was a cooler color that you didn't otherwise see. Sometimes I think it was better quality control for that model. Pretty cool. This is one that is super nostalgic for me, and that is the Blacktop series of Telecasters. These feature 2 humbucker pickups, and they had either a rosewood fretboard or maple fretboard and 22 frets. These are kind of a little bit more of a modern take on a Tele, and a lot of people playing heavier music really liked these when they came out. As well as doing a standard scale version, they also made a baritone scale version coming with a 27-inch scale length. These feature an HSS pickup configuration, and they're pretty awesome. They're really hard to find, so if you can find one, definitely pick it up. They've gotten quite pricey these days. I definitely see why. These are good quality Teles. They're certainly not the best thing that's out there, but I like them for what they are. The pickups are okay. They're a little muddy. Wouldn't be a bad idea to upgrade them whether you're looking at the baritone or you're looking at the standard Blacktop. Very cool. They get my seal of approval. Are they the best thing Fender's ever made? No, the quality control is kind of whatever on these, but I love the specs on these, and for what they are, they're pretty cool. Now we're getting into some of the reissue stuff, and the first one from the Mexico line is the Classic Player. I actually have one. This is one of mine. I've played many a show with this guitar. It is very beat up now. This is their reissue of the 72 Tele Deluxe, so you get the wide range humbuckers. This one's definitely been through it. The airlines were not so kind to this one on multiple occasions. These are great. The quality is notably better on any of these Classic Player guitars I've noticed than the standard Telecasters. They tend to just be a notch up in every level, from electronics to hardware to just overall construction. Definitely more attention to detail went into these, and they have a lot cooler designs too. While these stay pretty true to vintage from an aesthetic standpoint, specs wise, a lot of these are not as correct. You'll see like a 50s or 60s Tele with a 9.5 radius when that would have had a 7.25 radius, as I know a lot of players are going to prefer that. And that's kind of what this line was for, was somebody who wants vintage aesthetics, appointments, and vintage vibe, but kind of modern playability, and I think they're pretty cool for what they are. You'll see that come up a lot on this list. So if you're looking at Fender Mexico, but you want a little bit more vintage correct, they made the Classic Series, which is a bit of a deviation from the Classic Player. These actually have the right radius. They sometimes have better pickups. Between the Classic Player and Classic Series, these are kind of my 2 favorite things from the Mexico line. I back both of these. There is something that I'm gonna recommend you move up to instead of these guitars. It's only a little bit more money, so stay tuned for that. Whether you're looking at a Classic Player or a Classic Series, they're cool. We've now gotten to the original Fender Player series that we saw released in 2018. These are definitely a bit of a mixed bag. They're not my favorite thing that Fender has ever put out. This is basically an upgraded version of the standard Telecaster. This replaced the standard Telecaster, added better pickups. They now have Alnico pickups as well as 22 frets instead of 21. And I do think these are closer to an American standard than a Fender standard Telecaster was, but they just, I don't know, they don't really have any vibe. They're all decent, but none that, I've never played one that really spoke to me that much. That could also just be where I was at in my guitar buying, collecting, selling, playing journey. I've never played one that's terrible, but I've never played one that really blew me away either. I probably wouldn't recommend these unless you like absolutely have your heart set on them. If you're looking at one of these, I would probably recommend you either push your budget up to something else from this list that I maybe more highly recommend, or even going down to like a Squier Classic Vibe or something like that. They're just kind of whatever. So around the same time they launched the Player series, they also replaced the Classic Player and Classic series with the Ventera series. This is the modern, or was the modern, version of the Mexico reissue guitars. And I feel a similar way to these as the Player series. I do like them better than the Player series, but they had like Pau Ferro fretboards and a few other specs that I didn't love. These, again, they're fine, but they're definitely not my favorite thing from Fender. Definitely not my favorite thing from Fender Mexico. They're all right. As of this year, some of my complaints have been answered by the Player 2 and Ventera 2 line. So the Player 2, I think, is actually a really great upgrade over the Player series. You now start to see rosewood fretboards and like rolled fingerboard edges, which is really, really nice. I've played a couple of these and they definitely felt a lot better than the original Player series and definitely felt more inspiring to play. They're still fine. I don't think that they're anything too crazy. I know I keep saying this, but I would push your budget up just a little bit to move it to something a little bit better. But these do the job. I'm sure they'll be a reliable instrument for years to come, so nothing wrong with that. Likewise with the Ventera 2 series, they also did the same upgrades. They're definitely better than the original Ventera. I think they get close to those Classic Player and Classic Series guitars. I probably still lightly prefer those older reissues or going a different route. I still back these if you play, whether it's a Player 2 or a Ventera 2 and you really like it. That's awesome. I hope you enjoy it, make some awesome music with it. Depending what your application is, maybe move one direction or the other a little bit. That concludes Fender Mexico. Now we're going to dive into some guitars that were not made in Mexico, America, or Japan. They were guitars made in Korea, China, or Indonesia. So the first one I want to talk about here is the Fender FMT Telecaster. This is kind of a special edition Tele that goes a little outside what I mostly wanted to look at on this list, but I still thought it was worth noting. These were made in Indonesia or Korea and feature flame maple top finishes, as well as humbucker pickups. As well as doing a flame maple, they also did like a gold top version, as well as a spalted maple version, which I have here. Here we go. It's from my own collection. I really, really like these. They do not play like a typical Fender at all, so if you are expecting a traditional Tele, this is not that. I have a friend who jokingly calls these the Schecter Teles because in some ways they do almost feel like a Schecter or an ESP, but it says Fender on it. This is actually made in the same factory as a lot of Schecter or LTD or Cork guitars would be, so math checks out. It is set neck construction, so very not normal for a Tele, but the quality on these is actually really, really great. I don't know that I've played one that's been bad, which is saying something as these come out of Korea or Indonesia. This specific example is out of Korea. These are great, whether you're looking at the spalted maple, one of the flame maples, or one of the other colors. They also did a scorpion version of this, which is pretty cool. Check them out. So the next one on the list is a guitar they haven't made in a while, and I don't think they'll be making again anytime soon, and that is the Fender Modern Player Telecaster. They did a Modern Player Telecaster Plus, as well as a Modern Player Thinline Telecaster Deluxe. These are interesting guitars. The specs on both of these are actually really, really cool, but the quality control is pretty wonky. These are made in China, and it's one of the only times you'll see a actual Fender branded guitar made in China. Obviously, most Chinese made stuff is delegated over to the Squier line. This was a proper made Fender. I think these were like $500-ish new when they came out back in the early to mid 2010s. They came in price-wise just a little under your standard Mexico stuff. And I will say, they had cooler specs. Like, I love the pickup configurations here. The ones that I've played that have been well kept and are in nice shape actually play really, really well. So I have no problems there, but every time I see one of these and get to play one that's in a little bit rougher shape, that's maybe lived a tougher life, maybe it's been toured or whatever, just seen heavy use, they don't hold up super well. The fretwork is definitely pretty hit or miss on these. I've played some that definitely need some help. I would just be very mindful of if the one you're looking at is gonna play well, or how well it's been taken care of. These are maybe not something I would be getting super serious about buying right now. There's a reason they don't make them anymore. These are very similar in quality to like a Squier Classic Vibe or Vintage Modified, which I think is really interesting to note because people love those two series and they're almost unanimously praised. But then when these guitars are put out, being almost exactly the same in quality, a lot of people hated them. I think that's because once it has the Fender name on it, just the expectation level drastically increases, as it should. As a Fender guitar, they're not rated the best, but when they did a Squier line that was similar, people love to take that for what you will. This is a pretty hard to find guitar, but I still thought it was worth noting. They, at one point, were doing a special edition light ash Telecaster, and it is one of the only times that you'll see a traditional style Tele made in Korea. As the name implies, they are very lightweight, they're very resonant. Quality-wise, it's really tough to know where to pin this. I would say it's maybe a little better than your standard Mexico Tele, but then if you get into the nicer Mexico stuff like the Classic Player, I think the Classic Player is a little better than these. They're not common, so they're kind of expensive these days. If you love love that lightweight thing and you love that it's ash and you love the specs of this, I definitely don't recommend against it, but they're nothing too crazy. Probably wouldn't put too much effort into tracking one of these down unless it's like exactly what you need. We are now to probably my favorite part of Fender's lineup, and that is Fender Japan. I know there's no surprise if you already watched this channel. We travel to Japan a couple times a year to go find Fender Japan stuff, as most of it never ends up over here in the States. The history of Fender Japan is extremely rich, and there's so much that we talked about here, but we don't have time to get into all that in this video. That deserves a video on its own. But we're gonna be checking out a few different lines that they have done out of Japan. Because I'm not doing vintage, I'm not gonna be talking about the JV stuff. That just carries a lot higher price, and I think there's a lot of context that needs to be said with the JV line. So we're gonna be starting at the original made in Japan stuff, starting around 84. And that's where we're gonna start, which is the Fender Japan reissue line. I'm actually gonna group a lot of different eras together here because there's just not enough time to get into all of it. This is gonna be everything from 84, from the original made in Japan, to craft in Japan, you'll see from the late 90s to the early 2000s, and then the small window from like 2007 to 2010, where they went back to made in Japan, but before the JD line. A lot to unpack there. We don't have time for that, so let's just talk about these original Fender Japan reissue guitars. These are some of my favorite guitars Fender has ever made. I think for the price point you can get one at, this is it. They are unbeatable. They play fantastic. They set up well. Usually the fretwork from the factory is great. Obviously, if you find a used example, your mileage may vary with the condition the frets are in at that moment. Man, the quality control is just so good on these, and these really strike a nice bit above the Fender Mexico reissue stuff. Price-wise, they're not that much more, so if you're kind of looking at a classic player, classic series, or new Ventira, I would give these a shot. Here I have a 1993 TL72, so it's a reissue of a 72 Telecaster, and this is very accurate to what you'd be getting with a 72 Telecaster. The weight is great here, neck profile is great, pickups sound good. This is it. If you are looking for a vintage style Fender Telecaster in this price range, whether you're getting one of the 50 style ones, 60 style ones, or something like this, the 72 reissue, you can't go wrong. Back in the 80s, another line that Fender did in Japan that was pretty popular was the Boxer series and Contemporary series of Telecasters. These at the time had a lot more modern specs, so you'll see like humbuckers, you'll see Kaler tremolos, and all kinds of different locking tremolos. They get a little crazy. I like these. It is kind of hard to find parts for these days. Make sure you're getting one that still has everything with it, but they play really good. I've noticed a lot of these are in very rough condition. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as they've been serviced appropriately, they will probably still play as they should. These had very thick poly finishes, so I've noticed they'll get pretty chipped up, but they're very durable guitars. But if you find one that plays great, this is a great Tele. Not a very traditional Tele, but it's a cool one. If you want something shreddy, if you want a locking trem, this is where I would look. This next one is a guitar that you'll very rarely see outside of Japan, as it was only made for the Japanese market and never really exported much, and that is the Fender Standard Telecaster MIJ. Throughout most of Fender Japan's history, all the way from 83 to 2015, you'll see some type of standard Telecaster being manufactured. That would be kind of comparable to like an American standard or even like a Mexico standard. But specifically, I want to talk about the version that was made from 1997 to 2006. I think this was kind of made to be their version of the Mexico standard Telecaster, even though it did carry a little bit higher cost at launch. These kind of sit right in the middle between a Mexico standard and an American standard. Quality is pretty good on these. I would say the biggest difference is that the quality control is way better on these than the Mexico standard. The quality of parts and components is probably a little better, but not a big difference. Similar finishes and stuff to the Mexico one, even a similar silver logo on the headstock. Nothing wrong with these. They're definitely not as cool as the reissue series to me, and they're definitely not as high echelon of guitar as the reissue series from Fender Japan, but they're still cool. And if you're really looking for something on a budget, I would definitely look at these. You can get these for around the same price as a Player Series Tele. I would definitely recommend this over the Player Series. So in 2012, when Fender shifted over to the JD line, where the serials all start with JD for their Fender Japan stuff, their original reissue line was called the Fender Classic Series, which is very confusing with the Mexico Classic Series. But this was basically a continuation of Fender Japan's reissue series, doing new versions of the classic Telecaster designs. These go right into the new traditional series. They're the same line, they just got renamed the traditional series. I absolutely love these. Rather than doing specific reissue years, you'll now see basically a Fender traditional 60s Telecaster, such as this one. Rather than reissuing specific years like a 62 Tele, it's a little bit looser with the traditional series. This is a traditional 60s Tele. So It's just a 60s style Telecaster. It's not designated to one specific year. These of course feature proper rosewood whenever applicable. There's never any Palfare or anything like that being used. So that's always cool. Quality wise, these really rival a lot of the American reissue guitars, a lot of the American vintage stuff. The only real downside of these over something like an AVRI is that they are a poly finish. This is about as good as it gets. If you're looking at a Ventira 2, you really want a new guitar, I would really urge you to maybe push the budget up a little bit and get something like this from the Fender Japan traditional series, as they are a little bit more faithful recreations of those classic guitars with much better build quality and better parts. These are pretty much only made for the Japanese market. So if you're in the US, you'll have to find a dealer that has access to these. We are proud to be one of those. So if you're looking for anything Fender Japan, whether new or old, please consider checking out our site at aflashphotogear.com. We are very proud to have a pretty comprehensive selection of these. As I mentioned earlier, we go over to Japan multiple times a year to go handpick most of these. Please check out our inventory if you're in the market for something like this. The reason that I put so much resources into making sure you have a comprehensive Fender Japan line is because I think it is a really great point in the Fender line where the quality is really great. They have a lot of awesome options that you can't get anywhere else. And it's at a really accessible price point. This is something that working musicians can afford. That's why I back it so hard. It's not just because we have them. We all play Fender Japan stuff outside of the shop. We love the stuff. If you're looking for something a little bit more modern, but still has a bit of like vintage flair, then Fender Japan's Hybrid and Hybrid 2 lines might be the ones to check out. This is a pretty cool one, coming in gold with a P90 in the neck. What's not to love here? Well, this definitely has a cool like vintage aesthetic. You still get 22 frets. You get a 9.5 radius, so it'll feel a little more modern, as well as more modern frets. I would say the quality is right on par for whether you're looking at a hybrid or a traditional series. I kind of look at the traditional series as what the player series wants to be, but it just doesn't get there quality wise. So if you're looking at a player series, you don't have enough money to get all the way to the American one. These are kind of right in between, and I would definitely give them a look. The next series we're going to talk about here for Fender Japan, and the last series out of their domestic line, is going to be the Fender Heritage series. This is their top shelf reissue Telecaster. This actually does feature a nitro top coat finish-wise, so this is right there with the newer American vintage stuff. It's tough to choose between the two. I often talk about how Fender Japan is still making a domestic line that is right on par quality-wise with our American line, and they charge about the same amount for it. This is part of what I'm talking about, as well as the hybrid and traditional lines, but this is a perfect example of that. There's nothing about this that is any less than an American-made Fender. There's nothing budget about this. This is just a fantastic Telecaster, which is made very well with some great and very accurate vintage specs. If you're between this and an American vintage, that's definitely a tough choice. They're both really great. They're both kind of going to be in the same price range. If you find a Fender Heritage series Telecaster, that's a good. The last kind of subset of Fender Japan guitars I want to talk about are their export line of guitars. While most stuff does stay within Japan and doesn't end up here in the States, they still do export some Japan-made guitars from time to time. Real quickly, want to touch on their JV Modified line, their reissue of the Boxer series, and the FSR International series that they have recently reissued. So starting with the JV Modified series, this was kind of a reissue of those original JV guitars from the early 80s, and they exported these to the US. I was really excited to see these come out and see Fender Japan guitars being widely available in the States. Unfortunately, this line is a little bit different than what you'll see with their domestic reissue line, and I actually don't like it as much. The necks have this really weird like matte finish. They're not glossy like you would expect like the original JVs were, so kind of some really odd choices across the board. The quality's good here, but I will say every time I've played one, I'm a little bummed out. They definitely don't live up to what I really enjoy about Fender Japan. I'd probably pass on this line. It's still comparable with like Fender Mexico, but when I give this high praise to Fender Japan, it's not for this series of guitars. They're just not my favorite. If I'm gonna take points off for anything from Fender Japan, it's probably this line. Another export line they did was the Boxer series reissue, which they did just a few years ago, and I think they've actually recently discontinued it. I love these guitars. I think these are actually fairly faithful recreations to the classic Boxer series from the 80s. They don't feel exactly the same, and they've definitely changed some specs around, but the quality here is awesome. They have some great specs that you're not gonna find on any other guitars. The price point on these is really reasonable, whether it was at retail or what they're going for now used. These are definitely worth checking out. I big back these. The last export line I wanna talk about for Japan is one that just recently was discontinued, and that is the International series. So back in the very early 80s, Fender did a line of International series colors. These are very flashy colors they did in Fender US. And then a couple years ago, Fender Japan decided to reissue these guitars in Japan. Here we have the Morocco Red, which is very vibrant, very vibey telly here. And these are awesome. I remember actually seeing these right when they dropped. We were in a shop in Shibuya and saw all these colors and we're like, we need to bring these back. So we ended up bringing a bunch back on that trip. And then about 3 months later, I saw that Fender was actually offering these here in the States. I saw them pop up on the Guitar Center site, Musician's Friend site, as well as some other sites. That was pretty cool to see. These are absolutely true to the Fender reissue stuff that we love so much. These are awesome. The quality is great and the cool colors just makes it even better. If you find one of these, definitely don't pass it up. They're pretty awesome. That concludes Fender Japan. I know we spent a ton of time there, but we could have spent even more. We have finally got into Fender US, the origin of Fender. Most of the best guitars ever made have been obviously made right here in the States from Fender. The first one we're going to talk about here is the staple, it's the classic, it is the Fender American Standard Telecaster. Well, they made some guitars in the early 80s that were under the Standard Telecaster name. The American Standard as we know it today started in 1988 and would run all the way up until 2016 with very little changes. From 2000 to 2007, these were just called American Series Telecasters, but they're the same guitar. By the time you got to 2016, these were discontinued and the Fender American Professional line would start. There's not much to say here that hasn't been said a million times, but this is the flagship American Fender Tele. When somebody says they have a Fender American Tele, this is what I'm picturing. I'm assuming they're talking about this guitar. They're a good blend of vintage and modern, a little more modern than vintage, but I've noticed great quality through every single year. I personally own one of these. This is mine from 2015. It's awesome. This one's ash. And one thing that's really worth noting here, if you're shopping for an American Standard, I highly recommend looking for one between 2012 and 2016, as these would come with custom shop pickups from the factory, which sound incredible. I like these a lot better than the pickups that were in the other years of American Standard, and I still like them better than the newer V-Mod pickups that you'll see in the American Professional line. I would say any year of the American Standard is going to treat you well. The 2012 to 2016 come with those pickups, so that is a nice little bonus there. We big back the American Standard. There's a reason that these are so iconic. In 2016, you would see the discontinuation of the Fender American Standard Telecasters and Stratocasters and all that stuff, and the American Professional line would begin. These guitars initially didn't have a ton of changes from the American Standard. The biggest one was probably the release of the V-Mod pickups, which I do like these pickups better than just the older Fender US Tele pickups. Like I said, I do prefer the years with the custom shop Tele pickups. Those sound a little better to my ear. These play great. This line will only last for a few years as they recently discontinued that and now have the American Professional 2. This is just kind of a continuation of Fender's flagship Tele. These are cool. We big back it. The Fender American Professional 2 would continue on with this series, and the biggest change that I've noticed here is that they added a neck carve. Now it's a little easier to access the upper frets, which kind of puts this Tele more into a modern territory than any prior American Standard or American Professional Tele. Still very cool, but very interesting to see the direction they're going in with these. I think Fender is kind of doubling down on making this a very utilitarian guitar, which I think is very true to their original vision. They're keeping the vintage correct ones vintage correct. The modern ones are just getting more and more modern. Still like the American Professional 2 series, and again, if you see one and you like it, I'm sure it will last you for years to come. They make some really cool, unique colors, so I love that. I will say, if you're looking for vintage style, whether it's the American Standard, American Professional, American Professional 2, this is not where I would look. I would go elsewhere. But if you just want a good straight ahead Tele, any of these series are going to treat you well. For a very long time now, Fender has always offered a guitar that's kind of one notch under the American Standard of the time for a little bit less. For a long time, that was the American Special. The American Special Teles are great. These would always retail for just a little bit less and feature some different specs, such as Texas Special pickups, which sound awesome. The neck is a little bit different. The logo is closer to like a 70s style. These just have a great vibe overall. I don't really know where they cut costs here, as they feel very comparable in quality to an American Standard. They're a little different. They're not the same. I wouldn't buy an American Special instead, but if you find an American Special and you love how it plays, you see one online and you love the aesthetic, I would check it out. Big seal of approval from me. Pushing it a step further from that, they also did the Highway 1 series for a while, which is very similar to the American Special, but these had a very thin nitro finish that would wear kind of as you play it, and I love these. These are kind of my favorite of the standard American stuff. The neck profile is great, pickups sound great, and if you bring it on the road and play it, it is going to definitely show it, and it is going to kind of have that look of a vintage worn-in guitar. We love the Highway 1 series. While the American Special and Highway 1 lines have been long discontinued, Fender is now offering the American Performer line. This literally just picks up where the American Special left off. It is a little bit cheaper than the American Professional with some different features. I've noticed a bigger difference here. I do think if you love a newer American Professional 2, the American Performer is not going to be the same guitar, but it's still cool for what it is. If you played an American Professional 2 and you're attracted to the Performer just because the price is a little less, I'd probably recommend staying with the American Professional 2, as now that there's been so many little changes implemented with that flagship line, the American Performer is quite a bit different. It's a lot more straight ahead. So I actually think this has a cooler place in the market than it used to. But these are cool. They're not the same, so I wouldn't compromise and go from an American Professional 2 to a Performer. But if you're looking for a cool straight ahead American Tele, an American Performer is a great way to go. So these next three I'm going to group together as they all are similar, which is some different specs changing year to year. And that is Fender's modern line of American Telecasters, being the American Deluxe line, which was then replaced with the American Elite line, which was then replaced with the American Ultra line. I have one here. This is my Fender American Deluxe Telecaster from 2012. This does not feel like a vintage Tele at all. These have some great modern specs, such as a compound radius and locking tuners. Once again, you have the contoured neck carve there, so that's pretty great. The necks here are nice and slim. With these guitars, you get noiseless pickups, which I know some people don't like. I really like them. I think they work great if you're out gigging, especially if you're playing like different types of venues every night, where sometimes the power maybe isn't the best and things can get really noisy. And with vintage style pickups, the noiseless pickups do alleviate that issue, so you get all of the bite of Fender Telecaster pickups without having to deal with all the noise. These do sound a little more compressed than your standard Tele pickup. They almost verge into P90 territory. They're definitely a little bit hotter. I love these for what they are, and I give a big recommendation to check out these guitars, whether it's the American Deluxe, the Elite, or the Ultra. These modern series have never really gotten super collectible. They haven't held their value as well as other guitars have since their inception with the American Deluxe line. These have always been a good bit more than the American Standard or equivalent of that time, but the used prices don't reflect that. You can a lot of times find these for less than an American Standard. I've played many gigs with this one and it is quite beat up. It definitely has some battle scars. These are extremely reliable. They stay in tune well. They sound great. It's never let me down. For me, that's what I'm looking for in a Tele. It does it with a very cool aesthetic. So if that's what you're looking for, don't sleep on these. I think they're kind of like an underrated gem. So one of my favorite series that Fender has ever done has been their American Vintage series. This has come in a few different iterations, starting as their US Vintage line, and then eventually turning into the American Vintage Reissue series, then the American Vintage series, and then you would later see it discontinued. But I want to talk about all these kind of together, even though there's so many different eras in here that deserve their own time in the sun. But again, this video is already getting super long, so maybe we'll do a whole video on the different American reissue stuff over the years. Talking about just the Fender American Vintage line in general, everything from the late 80s all the way up until 2017 when they were discontinued. These to me are some of the best value guitars that Fender has ever made if you want vintage style made in the US with correct specs. Year to year, things will definitely differ as far as how vintage correct they are. The era from 2012 to 2017 is kind of known as the year that is the most vintage correct, where they were known under just the American Vintage series. These are great. They have a nitro finish, which again will vary year to year. Sometimes it is a nitro top coat over poly, sometimes it's a full nitro finish. These do a great job at recreating a classic 50s, 60s, or 70s Telecaster for a lot less than the custom shop, and they've offered them some great colors over the years. Once again, these are going to be very reliable Telecasters that will last you for years and years to come. Given that they all have varying levels of nitro lacquer finish, they will also wear as you play them, and so the more that they are played, the more that they will start to look like a vintage guitar. I big back every iteration of the American Vintage series, specifically here from the 90s up until about 2017. If you are looking for a vintage style Fender and you have the budget for it, this is a great place to land. So in 2017, the American Vintage line was discontinued and was replaced by the American Original line. I still really like these. I think these are still a great way to get a vintage styled Fender that is made recently for not a crazy amount of money. For better or worse, they take a little more liberties here with the American Original series. You will not see the correct fretboard radiuses. They'll all have a 9.5 inch radius, so a little bit flatter, and they'll have more modern style frets. But aesthetically, they definitely look like vintage Fenders. They mostly play like vintage Fenders. You'll usually see them sell for a little bit less than your American Vintage reissue, so this is definitely a great place to look. But I actually think these have more in common with the Fender Hot Rod American Vintage series, which we didn't really really talk about in this video much. That was a series where they did, you know, a more modern take on a vintage telly. It was almost like if you had a vintage telly that you'd done a refret on and some other thing. I think this series is more that. It's more, it looks vintage, but the specs aren't always true to that year. Like with the Fender Japan traditional series, you'll also see them not be reissuing a specific year. It's not gonna be a 52 telly, it's going to be a 50s telly. I still back these. I probably wouldn't pay as much for one of these as a proper American vintage. Don't pass these up. If you can find one for a good price, I would have no problem recommending it, but I probably wouldn't get as excited about this as a couple other options on this list. Recently, the American Original line was discontinued and replaced by the American Vintage 2 line, which was way more true to form of that original American Vintage series like we just mentioned. I much more highly recommend checking out the American Vintage 2 line over the American Original line, but I would still recommend the older American Vintage Reissue, and US Vintage Series Telecasters over the American Vintage 2. The specs are all pretty correct on the ABRI2 stuff, but I did notice the finish is like way thicker on these. Even though it does have a nitro top coat, the poly finish under it is so thick. I don't know, they don't have the resonance that a lot of the older American Vintage Series guitarists did, which is kind of a bummer. Upon playing these, they kind of feel more like a modern Fender with vintage appointments. So these are still good. I still really like these. If that's what you're after, and there's nothing wrong with that, that's a great thing to be after, check these out. But if you want it to be a little more true, a little bit thinner finish, probably be looking for a little bit older American Vintage. I know we're probably getting a little confusing here with all these different series. That's kind of the point of this video, is like, why has Fender done so many guitars that are like the same thing? I feel like we all kind of want the same thing, but they kind of give it to us with varying amounts of accuracy of what the customer actually wants. So hopefully this video so far is kind of breaking that down a little bit and making it a little easier to understand, as it definitely took me a long time to understand the intricate differences from line to line. With all that being said, that actually is going to be the conclusion of the series. So now it's time to talk about which ones I think are the best and where I think your money is best spent. Let's go through my top 5. So these are not going to be in any particular order. These are just the 5 guitars that I would recommend to taste. These are kind of the lines that do each thing the best for the price point that it hits, in my opinion. Like I said earlier in this video, I've been fortunate enough to own multiple examples of almost all of these lines we discussed today. If you are looking for a vintage style Telecaster, you want it to be as correct as you can, you're not looking to get into custom shop, but you have the budget to buy an American guitar, I would be looking at the American Vintage series. Whether it is an American Vintage reissue, one of the 2012 to 2017 American Vintage series, or a US Vintage series from a long time ago, I love all of these. I think these are the best way to get into a really true to form vintage Telecaster. They're kind of gonna float between $2,000 and $3,000, depending on what you're looking for, depending on the color. Some colors that they haven't made often are very collectible now, so you'll see them demand a pretty high premium. But overall, these are some of my favorite vintage style tellies that Fender has ever made. My next pick is also going to be of vintage style Fenders, and that is going to be literally any of the Fender Japan reissue stuff, whether it is the original made in Japan or then crafted in Japan stuff, or the modern JD stuff that they're making now from the traditional line. I would highly recommend checking these out. If you're not in a position where you want to spend as much as the American vintage guitarists demand, where you are kind of in the $1,000 to $2,000 range, you're looking for a vintage correct Fender, whether it's you're pushing up a little bit from the Vintera 2, or the American Vintage line is a little bit out of reach, or they just don't even offer the color you want or something like that, the Fender traditional line or even any of the older Fender Japan reissue stuff is definitely the place that I would look. I own a number of guitars that would fall under this category, and they're all great. So if you're not looking for something that is vintage correct, you want something that's super modern, my recommendation is to look at the Fender American Deluxe, Elite, or Ultra line, specifically the Deluxe and Elite, because price-wise on the used market, you just literally can't beat these. A lot of times you'll see these for less than an American Standard or American Professional, and these are just top shelf instruments. They're not vintage correct, so if that's what you want, I would go for one of the other 2 recommendations. If you want something that's gonna be modern, compound radius, logging tuners, this is a great place to go. I don't think you need to go to Fender Mexico. I would just go straight for an American Deluxe, American Elite, or American Ultra. These guitars have awesome aesthetics, great utility features, and will serve you for years to come. So if you're kind of sitting in the middle where you don't want something that's super modern, but you don't really care if it's vintage correct, I would recommend you go for one of the flagship American guitars. the American Standard or the American Pro or Pro 2. There's a reason these have always been the Fender flagship line. They do what they do well. They're proper Telecasters, and I think whether you're looking at the newest version or the oldest version, I think these really hit what Leo Fender was going for when he designed the Telecaster, which is just a utilitarian guitar that stays in tune well, that you can replace parts on, and it'll serve you for years to come. These will last you a lifetime if treated properly. I've had mine for years, and I don't think it's gonna be going anywhere anytime soon. So my last pick here is one that I just think is really fun. It's not really in any particular direction, and that is the Highway 1 series. I just think these are a great value. It's a straight ahead American Telecaster with a nice thin nitro finish. They have great sounding pickups. They're not crazy expensive, and they're just awesome. I would feel great about taking one of these out on the road or taking it into a session. You can't go wrong with the Highway 1, and it probably is like the most straight ahead Tele on this list, I would say. There's no frills, it's just a cool guitar. So that is gonna be my final recommendation there. This has been a way longer video than I anticipated. Thank you guys so much for making all the way through here. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you found value here. There's been so many great Telecasters made over the years, and it is so easy to get confused between all the different lines. I hope that this video helped clear up some confusion and help kind of point you in a direction you're going for. Probably noticed with my top 5 list there, I did omit Fender Mexico. That wasn't on purpose necessarily, but kind of looking back at this, well, I actually do really like a lot of the guitars from Fender Mexico. They can be kind of neither here nor there. They're getting so expensive these days that it's hard to recommend you spend the money that they're going for when there's just other options that aren't that much more. And even the Squier stuff, for what it is getting decent. So if you're really on a budget, nothing wrong with checking out the Squier stuff. If you're looking for that pro level instrument, I'd really focus on Fender US and Fender Japan. Let me know down below in the comments what your guys' favorite Telecasters that Fender has made over the years are. There's so many that we didn't note in this list, so especially if it's not on this list, please bring it up down below. We would love to read your comments and hear your guys' stories. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, share the video, and all that good stuff, and we will see you in another video soon. Bye.